Hi, my name is Rebecca Miller. I'm a PhD candidate in the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources at Stanford University. My talk is on the impacts of COVID-19 on wildfire recovery. California faces a worrisome trend in experiencing really large wildfires, with 2020 breaking records in the total acres burned in the state. This graph depicts the number of wildfires on the axis on the left, and then the number of acres burned on the axis on the right. And though the number of wildfires that burn in California each year remains fairly constant at around 8,000, we see this upward tick in the number of acres burned each year. And in fact, in 2020, we've seen already over 4 million acres burn in the state, which is about 4% of the entire state catching on fire just in 2020, far more than in any previous year. This is especially concerning in light of already seeing really severe wildfires just in the past couple of years. 3 of the top 20 largest California wildfires took place in either 2017 or 2018. And the top 7 wildfires in California, the largest wildfires, 5 of those 7 took place in 2020. So a very concerning trend that we're starting to be seeing. In part because many of the areas that burned in 2020 were in regions that actually had previously burned in some of these earlier fires. So for example, the August Complex Fire, the Glass Fire, and the North Complex Fire, all in Northern California, all burned in areas that had previously seen significant fires in 2017 or 2018. And here I'm going to be focusing in on the area affected by the North Complex Fire, which was also an area affected by the Camp Fire 2 years earlier. So in this talk, I'm going to be talking about recovery from the 2018 Camp Fire, which I've depicted an image from here, which is also the deadliest and the most destructive fire in California's history. This fire took place in Butte County, which is a rural county in Northern California, and primarily hit the town of Paradise, though it also affected nearby areas like Naggea, Concow, and Yankee Hill. And here in this research, I'm exploring the joint impacts of COVID-19 and the 2020 wildfire season on recovery from the area that was already affected by the 2018 Camp Fire. When we think about the 2020 wildfire season, we really can't ignore the fact that COVID-19 has affected this wildfire season, just as it's affected every other aspect of all of our lives since its beginning several months ago, almost a year ago. And so in this research, I'm conducting interviews with representatives from various nonprofits in the region who are working on wildfire recovery. There's a long-term recovery group called the Campfire Collaborative, which is composed of a number of nonprofit organizations. And I've been conducting interviews with people to talk to them about what's been going well and what some of the challenges have been in wildfire recovery. But as I've been doing this research, the underlying element of COVID-19 can't be ignored. So I've been talking to my interviewees about some of their experiences handling wildfire recovery during COVID-19. And I've got some preliminary results based on the dozen or so interviews that I've already conducted. And the first preliminary result I want to share is that COVID-19 has pretty significantly slowed efforts to help with housing. I've got 2 quotes here from interviewees I want to share. The first one is somebody who works to order different houses, to order modular homes to help people get back into homes. And she told me, so my first home that I ordered took 6 weeks to get delivered. The last home that I ordered is going to take 22 weeks to be delivered because plants cannot work up to full capacity in production. All the other pieces in terms of material are being held up in ports. The China Trump thing is creating havoc at certain ports. And I still have another 10 homes to order. And I expect with those homes, I'll be looking at 32 weeks just to wait for those homes to be ordered. Not to mention the costs have gone up 20%. Another interviewee told me, we were expecting this summer we probably would have had some volunteer builds of houses, but we couldn't take any volunteers. So now we're a whole year away from doing that again, because when those volunteer teams come in for that kind of thing, it's during the summer or spring break, and we miss both of those windows. I also heard that virtual recovery is slower than in-person recovery efforts. And I know these are long quotes, but the big takeaway here is that connectivity, not having power, the need to build relationships with survivors in person, and even just the informal relationships that nonprofit meeting groups might have, like in the long-term recovery group, COVID has taken away that in-person networking, which has been so beneficial to building relationships and improving recovery, whereas virtual recovery has just slowed all of that down. And so in my future research, I'm going to continue conducting interviews, and I look forward to sharing additional updates on this research in January at the conference. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. I'll be speaking about the impact of COVID-19 and an oil spill on coastal communities in Mauritius, a small island state in the Indian Ocean. I'm Josheena Naggea, and I'm a Ph.D. candidate from Stanford University. So how do we respond to and recover following catastrophe? As the world faces the first major global pandemic in over 100 years, the small island of Mauritius suffered the worst ecological disaster in its history. Mauritius is located 500 miles off the east coast of Madagascar in the Western Indian Ocean, as shown in the map. On the 25th of July 2020, the MV Wakasho bulk carrier, a Japanese vessel flagged from Panama, wrecked off the island's southeast coast, spilling over 1,000 tons of fuel oil over more than 27 square kilometers of the coastline. The region was particularly known for its artisanal fishing villages and its concentration of nature reserves. The affected coastal communities have been the most vulnerable and also entirely dependent on fisheries and tourism for their livelihood. As with many such disastrous events, the response has been focused on the ecological consequences of the oil spill. With the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a travel lockdown from March to October 2020, which totally slowed down the influx of tourism, one of the main pillars of the economy. And in August, with the oil spill, one of the worst ecological disasters on the island, this entire coastal community along the affected region was completely brought on its knees. Despite the extensive impact on the local community, the human and social impacts and costs have received little attention. This disparity characterizes how we typically study the effects of catastrophe, assuming that we understand the damage to human well-being by quantifying the financial impacts of ecological degradation. For this study, in collaboration with the community leader from these different villages, we conducted 5 community meetings attended by more than 100 villages and 750 haphazard household surveys. The preliminary themes emerging have been definitely the financial impact on fisheries and tourism livelihoods, but also the impact on place and occupational attachment. People also shared with us the growing issues with food insecurity and overall changes in diet composition. Women used to just go out at sea, men and women actually both used to go out at sea to fish, and this is what would provide them their meals. And now with that not available, they have to tap into their savings to feed their families. A lot of kids, we've been told, have not been able to go to school because they don't have sufficient food to bring for lunch. So there's a lot of issues like that that are just like trickle effects of these two disasters. We've also observed issues linked to the informal economy. So gleaning, for example, typically done by women, where they go to fish for mollusks by foot and very simple tools, are some types of invisible jobs that are not supported by current compensation schemes, revealing systemic inequalities that have affected women in particular. Also, we've observed a loss of cultural heritage in these traditionally artisanal fishing villages, where people are mourning the loss of generational knowledge that will happen now, since we don't know for how long people won't be able to fish in the area. And even though fishing has been picked up again very recently, people over the island are still a bit apprehensive of having fish from that region. Villagers have also highlighted the fact that we are not receiving sufficient information about the safety of performing any such activities along the coast. And hence we observe that recovery focused solely on financial aspects of these disasters tend to be pretty limiting. And this is not an issue that we have observed just in Mauritius. These compounding effects of stresses, for example, in California, we've had the pandemic coincide with the fire season, or like in other regions in the Pacific, the pandemic and recurring effects of cyclones. So this case study in Mauritius should not be taken as just one singular event. It is very important to tease out how we are recovering from a catastrophe like that and what we can learn for other places as these disasters seem to be coming along more frequently. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Caroline Ferguson, and I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at Stanford University. Today, I'm going to be sharing some preliminary results from a paper that we're still working on the impacts of COVID-19 on fisheries-dependent communities in the Pacific. And for this study, we specifically looked at food security and fishing pressure. And when I say communities in the Pacific, we're really looking at rural communities that depend on fisheries for their food security and their livelihoods. When I say Pacific, for those not familiar with the region, it's an incredibly diverse region. And although we don't have an entirely representative sample, we don't have every single country in the region covered, we do have a pretty diverse set of countries covered, and those are listed on the slide. So when we went into this study, reading about the early effects of COVID-19 on communities across the world and on fisheries across the world, we really worried that communities in the Pacific were going to be heavily impacted. We're going to be facing serious food security challenges. And so we were really pleasantly surprised when we looked at the results to see that, in fact, communities are still surviving and thriving. And overall, the majority of key informants reported no changes in food security and no changes in fishing pressure. I want to caution that, again, this is a very diverse region, and we're looking at a lot of communities here. There was high variation in this study between countries, and in some countries between men and women. So it's not that everyone is perfectly food secure, and it's not that no one is facing challenges. Rather, what the region-wide findings suggest is that these local seafood economies that are not dependent on exporters, that aren't getting most of their food from importers, and that aren't relying primarily on tourists, but instead are really self-sufficient, people feeding each other, they appear to be pretty resilient to the global market shocks associated with COVID-19. And we found that this resilience primarily derived from two traditional practices. One was food sharing, so customary obligations to share food with others in the community, and also local food production. So many people told us that not only were they sharing more food since the market disruptions associated with COVID-19, but they had also increased their local food production through things like planting gardens or growing existing gardens, in some cases fishing more. And these both allowed communities, at least in this first wave of the pandemic, to adapt to the challenges that they did encounter. Now, these local seafood economies appear to be resilient to these global market shocks, and we know that they also support not only food security, but also food sovereignty, so the right to culturally appropriate and sustainably produced food, as well as public health, which is especially important in this region where so many suffer from chronic diseases associated with poor diet. I'll caution again that this is just the first wave of the pandemic, and we're still working through this paper. So we do expect things to get worse as the pandemic progresses. In a lot of communities, the canteens weren't fully stocked with imported foods that people can fall back on as supplementary to local foods. And we know that in the long term, climate change is going to threaten the ability of these communities to provide for themselves through local food production. So while this is a good sign, it's good news in this early wave of the pandemic, it shouldn't be taken to mean that a close eye and support is not needed. So thank you so much. I look forward to sharing more in the new year, and I welcome your questions. You can find me at cefergus, Fergus, at stanford.edu and www.ceferguson.com. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ranjitha Shivaram. I'm a third-year PhD candidate in the Stanford University Emmett Interdisciplinary program in Environment and Resources. And I'm super excited today to present some preliminary findings from a survey that I ran with the goal of understanding the scale and nature of changes in resource consumption patterns for US households during the COVID-19 pandemic. In my survey, I focused on energy, water, internet, transportation, grocery and non-grocery shopping needs, in addition to asking respondents about their well-being and productivity, their environmental perceptions, and also some key demographics. So in terms of methodology, we chose an online survey format because of its ability to deliver responses from a large representative sample of households for the US, and also because of social distancing needs and guidelines around public health during the pandemic. We received about 1,250 responses, and after data cleaning, we were able to extract results from 1,214 responses. Thinking a little bit about the need, motivation, and potential impact of this work, nearly 94% of the US population was under a stay-at-home or shelter-in-place order at the peak of the pandemic. So very quickly, when the pandemic hit, homes and households had to reimagine their house as a singular space that served all their needs for work, for school, for recreation, for entertainment, in addition to common household activities that were already being performed in the space. And so there could have been rather large changes in key resource consumption categories as they applied to households. So we need to understand how these changes came about and what the scale and nature of those changes were so that we can prepare not just for future waves of this pandemic and other public health emergencies, but also because there are parallels to climate change and the sudden disruptions that climate change phenomena can cause, and how that can alter the way households behave in response to those stresses. Um, so in the interest of time, I'll just share 4 key findings today, and I encourage you, I'm so happy to talk more. If you're interested, please get in touch. So looking first at energy, nearly 58% of the survey respondents anticipated an increase in electricity consumption, with nearly 28% anticipating a moderate to a large increase. And if you dig a little deeper into who anticipated this increase, you'll see in figure 1 on the right top of my slide, I've broken down these results by income and race. So low and medium income households were less likely to anticipate an increase in electricity consumption. Similarly, African American and Asian households were more likely to anticipate some kind of change, be it a decrease or an increase, in comparison to white households. And just to clarify, the race here is self-identified by survey respondents. These results quickly raise concerns around energy security and energy affordability. Who is able to bear the burden of a larger electricity bill when one needs to stay at home? So we need to think a little bit more about that. My second category of results looks at ICT, so internet usage. PCMag basically estimated that nearly 40 to 70% of broadband use increases have been observed across the US since the pandemic hit. And we find a similar scale of changes in our survey as well. So to give you a quick flavor of some categories of internet activities, the share of respondents in our survey who spent zero, so nil hours looking at video conferencing from their ICT devices before the pandemic was 54%, and it fell to 28% during the pandemic. Bear in mind that this survey was in May, June 2020, so a lot of things might have changed further since then as well. And also, the share of respondents who spent 3 to 5 hours on video streaming, so your Netflix and YouTube, was 20% before the pandemic and 30% during the pandemic. And interestingly, the same scales of change are observed not just for adults, but also children of the adult respondents in the survey. My third category of results look at transportation energy needs and commute modes. So in the right bottom corner of the slide, you can see a Sankey diagram that shows flows for different types of commute modes before and during the pandemic. So on the left, you'll see actually a significant share of people shifted to working from home. Our survey shows us that nearly 40% of our respondents work from home during the pandemic. This is largely in keeping with other research that has estimated this number to be at 42%. And you can look up research from the Stanford Graduate School of Business on this if you're interested. And car-based commutes fell from nearly 48% of our respondents to just 27% of our respondents. So this is a very large shift. And not only does this have energy implications in terms of commuting needs for cars, but also emissions implications as well. And you might have noticed in the news that actually vehicle miles traveled total, which is not just for commuting, but for shopping, recreation, other needs as well, is now back at pre-pandemic levels. The elasticity and degree of persistence of these changes is quite uncertain at this time. Finally, we looked at in-store shopping and how people looked for groceries and non-grocery items. And so we found that actually there is a significant shift to on-store to online shopping. So the share of respondents who just shopped only in-store was 64% during the pandemic and fell to 38% during the pandemic. And those who changed their mode of shopping, nearly 90% of them actually increased their online share. So I also have a bunch of regression models looking at scale and nature of change in correlation to key demographic characteristics, and I'm happy to discuss more if you're interested. Thank you so much for listening, and really looking forward to the other presenters as well. Thanks.